Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
Finding an SEO generally, just to point out as a kind of segue into the final discussion here, SEO is really neglected in what the agencies are offering. It seemed like they really were downplaying or not at all doing SEO for their clients. It was just really not on their list of services that they were offering, which is really, again, interesting and strange. Also, content was not being created. Now, I understand that can be very time intensive, although, as you mentioned, David, AI can be helpful in that area. You had a theory or maybe experience when we were talking about some of our own survey results, which again we have not yet published, but will someday in the distant future.
Near future.
Near future. You were talking about why you thought it was challenging for some of these larger agencies to do SEO. Maybe refresh my memory on that.
One possible theory for this is that it is very hard. I know, having talked to a number of friends who own or are very senior members of agencies that do SEO, it is very hard to retain quality SEO talent within an agency, because the folks who are doing a great job in the agency typically want to either start their own business or take a higher paying job in-house somewhere. And so it's very difficult to deliver quality SEO over an extended period of time as an agency owner, because the turnover is just so high for employees with domain expertise. And it's very expensive to train a junior person into sort of the SEO game. And then as soon as they level up, they tend to leave. So I think that that's one possible, certainly when you talk about the agencies with scale, which the CallRail survey was identifying, I think it's a little less true among boutiques, where you could very well have a 3 to 4 person SEO team as part of a larger 20 person, 30 person agency, where there's a lot of great synergies between them. There's a lot of interpersonal dynamics where they're less likely to leave. They are better paid just because it's seen as a real value for the agency's sort of overall portfolio, whereas it may not be seen as that for these larger shops who are experiencing higher churn or are just losing RFPs because they don't have that domain sort of expertise built in.
And they tend to focus on paid media.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So this other survey, which was conducted by, I'm going to mispronounce it, Aira.
I think that's correct. I think it's Aira. Yeah.
Okay, and then Women in Technical SEO. The CallRail survey, 50, I believe it was, it's over in excess of 50% of those respondents were from agencies with more than 1,000 people in them. So really, really big agencies. And 86%, I think, had at least 250 people. This survey was of agencies that were much smaller, and it was specifically about SEO. In the big agencies, the kind of notion that local SEO is a fad kind of speaks to the larger neglect of SEO. This is specifically about people doing SEO and technical SEO in particular. So we don't have the same kind of disdain, if you will, for SEO. But so interestingly, these folks conveyed, the survey talks about, what are your biggest challenges? What are the risks to SEO success? What are the tools that you're using? It's a good survey. We link to it from the newsletter. It's worth checking out. You don't have to download anything. It's not gated. The CallRail survey it requires a form. But what was pretty interesting to me is the kind of gestalt that you get from this survey is that people are doing SEO, but they're not getting a lot of respect for their work on some level, because the greatest challenge identified, the greatest challenge was having my recommendations implemented. Getting my recommendations implemented was the biggest challenge that these SEOs faced, and then showing the value of my work was number 2. But in addition, they also cited a lack of resources and a lack of buy-in or authority as risks to SEO success. So we've got people who are working in agencies with clients that are making recommendations that in many cases aren't being followed, or don't have authority to implement anything, or I guess that's for some in-house folks, or are not given sufficient resources really to do their jobs adequately. And this just was really striking to me. So we have the big agencies that are sort of not paying much attention to SEO, and then we have these SEO agencies that are working diligently, presumably to improve the ranking and visibility of their clients, but the clients aren't necessarily paying any attention or paying sufficient attention to those recommendations or giving them the resources to do their jobs effectively.
Isn't that what a retainer is for? So that you can repeat the same recommendation every month?
So I have a couple of theories, and again, largely based on a sample size of one in terms of my experience as a consultant working with companies of all sizes. Certainly when you get to larger clients, one of the issues with SEO tends to be one of the reasons SEO recommendations may not get implemented is at a larger client, it is very much a multidisciplinary implementation of recommendations. So you will have to talk to generally a designer of some kind, UX person. You generally have to work with an engineering team of some kind. You generally have to work with some kind of content team. And then maybe even sort of a generalized marketing team. So you usually have like 3 or 4 different departments across which these recommendations have to sort of get approved and somehow get funded. And a lot of times, because there isn't a single owner of SEO or in particular local SEO in a large organization, it sort of falls through the funding crack because there isn't a like guaranteed line item where, okay, yes, if I'm on the design team, I know I need to set aside, X $1,000s a year for user testing and user feedback and that sort of stuff, or Y dollars a year for design tools or whatever it is. SEO tends not to have sort of a specific line item in at least less digitally mature organizations. I think that if you are an organization that has a relatively senior leader who has experienced the success of SEO in a previous role, that person is likely to get the buy-in for these kinds of projects. But if you don't have that sort of internal champion who has experienced tremendous benefits from SEO historically, I think it is harder to get buy-in at larger companies. With respect to smaller companies, sometimes they just sort of don't have the bandwidth to execute. It's almost the flip side of the problem where you have too many cooks in an enterprise and not enough cooks in the smaller companies. So.
Or their focus shifts. Like one month they think X is important, so you give them a solution to X, but the next month they forgot that was important last month because they're totally swamped with some new problem.
Well, and there's also the issue that SEO is really kind of a long-term, it's a sort of medium and long-term proposition that's pretty holistic, as you're saying.
Yep.
And often these organizations are focused on near-term lead generation or near-term improvements. So what can we do to meet our numbers this quarter or next quarter, rather than it's kind of like performance marketing versus branding in a certain way. Even though SEO isn't exactly directed toward branding, it certainly can boost your brand. One final comment that we talked about before we started recording, in the category of what's the biggest risk to technical SEO success, that was one of the questions. Lack of resources, which I mentioned, was number 1. And then the second most common problem was technical debt, theoretically meaning not theoretically, meaning that the tools that they were using, the systems that they had set up were somehow flawed and didn't take SEO into account in that process. And that's a major obstacle if you're saying, Mike, your example was a CMS. We got to change our CMS because it's not optimized. There's going to be a lot of inertia in an organization about retaining the existing tools, especially in a big organization where everybody's already invested in using something. It's very hard to make those kinds of changes. All right. So we come to the end of episode 97. We're 3 away from episode 100, a really kind of significant milestone for us. But anybody want to say anything final before we sign off for the week?
Localized SEO is not a fad. It has been here for a decade.
Right. That conversation made me think of a whole new podcast we could do titled The Near Future.
Very good.
Exactly.
Spin-off number 896 of the Near Memo.
And AI, despite its myriad challenges and problematic aspects, is also definitely not a fad. I mean, Google has had Performance Max in the works for at least 8 or 10 years. They've been building up to this with, very deliberately. And now, as you say, they're shifting everything over. So on that note, thanks for listening again. Subscribe to our newsletter, tell your friends, and we'll be back next week with episode 98.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.